Frost crackled under worn leather boots. Not the delicate lacework kind, but thick frozen fractals spreading across the mud like shattered glass. The air bit, sharp and metallic, smelling of snow on the wind and the faint, almost ghostly tang of old hay drifting from the stable. Empty, mostly. Wind whistled through gaps in the ancient wood, a lonely sound that seemed to echo inside the chest of the man standing just outside the paddock fence. He shoved gloved hands deeper into his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold, against the weight pressing down. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? Silas hadn't planned on coming back here. Not to this place. Not to this silence. Yet here he stood, drawn like a moth to a flame that had already burned out. His brother, Eli, was 2 months gone. A sudden, stupid accident on black ice miles from this frozen field. The grief was a raw, physical thing, a constant ache behind his ribs, a hollowness in his gut that food couldn't fill. He'd avoided the stables, Eli's domain, like it was cursed. But today the silence in his own small house had become unbearable, a vacuum sucking the air from his lungs. He'd needed movement, distance, even if it led him here, to the last living piece of Eli. Inside the stable a shadow shifted, not a sound, just a presence felt more than seen. Silas forced his feet forward, the frozen ground crunching in protest. He pushed the heavy sliding door open just enough to slip through. The interior wasn't much warmer, just sheltered from the biting wind. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of gray light slicing through high windows. Hay dust tickled his nose. And then he saw him. Standing in the far stall, head low, was the quarter horse. Eli had called him Spirit, a name that felt painfully ironic now. The horse was a dark bay, almost black, his coat dull and rough-looking despite the cold. He stood unnervingly still, not resting, not sleeping, just standing, like a statue carved from grief itself. His eyes, large and dark, were fixed on the far wall, seeing nothing Silas could perceive. There was no flicker of interest, no twitch of an ear as Silas entered. Just that profound, unsettling stillness. The only movement was the faint plume of his breath in the frigid air, a small, living cloud against the dead quiet. He looked less like a creature of muscle and speed, and more like a monument to loss. Silas leaned against the rough wood of a support beam, the cold seeping through his coat. He didn't know what to do. Feed him? Eli had always handled that. Groom him? He'd barely touched a horse since he was a kid trailing after his big brother. This horse wasn't his. Spirit belonged to Eli, and Eli was gone. The horse felt like a stranger, a silent reproach in the gloom. Silas's own grief twisted, mingling with a useless frustration. Why was he here? What did this silent beast expect from him? He pushed off the beam, the sound loud in the stillness. He walked slowly down the central aisle, boots scuffing on the packed earth floor. He stopped a few feet from Spirit's stall door. The horse didn't move his head, but Silas felt the focus shift. Those dark eyes slid towards him, holding his gaze. Not wary, not curious, just aware. Deeply, profoundly aware. Silas saw the exhaustion etched around them, the slight tremor in the horse's flank that wasn't just from the cold. This wasn't stillness. This was shutdown. "Hey," Silas murmured, the word rasping in his dry throat. Useless. Spirit blinked, slow and heavy. A single ear twitched, rotated minutely towards the sound, then settled back. No other reaction. Silas remembered Eli's laugh, loud and booming, filling this space as he'd brushed this very horse, talking nonsense to him. The memory was a physical blow. He looked away, swallowing hard against the sudden tightness. He couldn't do this. Not today. Maybe not ever. He turned to leave, the familiar ache swelling, threatening to crack him open right there in the dusty aisle. He took one step, then another. The crunch of his boot on the gritty floor. Behind him, a sound. Soft. Almost imperceptible. Silas froze. Not the wind, not the settling timbers. He turned back slowly. Spirit had moved. Just a fraction. His massive head was no longer pointed rigidly at the wall. It was angled slightly towards Silas. His nostrils flared once, twice, drawing in the scent of the man, the cold air, the lingering ghosts. He took a single, deliberate step forward. Not towards Silas, not exactly, just forward, breaking the terrible statue-like pose. His dark eye fixed on Silas again, holding a question Silas couldn't decipher. The tremor in his flank seemed to ease, just a little. Silas stood rooted, caught between the impulse to flee the suffocating sadness of the place and the strange pull of that single step, that focused gaze. He wasn't Eli. He didn't have Eli's easy way, his booming confidence with animals. He was just Silas, broken and adrift. He took a hesitant breath. The air tasted of dust and cold and hoarse. He didn't speak. He just stood there, facing the horse, waiting, feeling utterly inadequate. Spirit lowered his head, a slow, deliberate movement. He stretched his neck out over the stall door, his muzzle reaching toward Silas, not touching him, just reaching into the space between them. His breath warmed the frigid air inches from Silas's gloved hand. Silas could see the fine hairs around the horse's nostrils, the dark moisture there. He could smell the sweet, grassy scent of his breath mingling with the stable's mustiness. Silas didn't move, didn't breathe. The horse's eye watched him, deep and liquid. There was no demand in it, no expectation, just a quiet presence, an offering of sorts. Slowly, ever so slowly, Silas uncurled his fingers inside his glove. He lifted his hand, not reaching out, just lifting it from his pocket. He held it there, palm open, vulnerable in the cold air a few inches from Spirit's muzzle. Spirit didn't flinch. He didn't sniff aggressively. He simply lowered his head a fraction more, his warm breath washing over Silas's bare palm. Then, with infinite gentleness, the soft, velvety skin of his muzzle brushed against Silas's knuckles. Once, a whisper of contact, a recognition. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was something more fundamental. An acknowledgement. I see you. You are here. Silas felt the touch resonate through his frozen core, a tiny spark of warmth against the vast cold of his grief. It wasn't joy. It wasn't comfort. It was connection. A fragile thread spun across the chasm Eli had left. He stood, like that for a long moment, the horse's breath warming his skin, the silence of the stable wrapping around them both, different now, less empty, less accusing. Just shared space. Finally, the cold began to seep back into his bones. He needed to go, to process this strange, quiet moment. He lowered his hand slowly, tucking it back into his pocket where the fading warmth felt, like a secret. He gave Spirit one last look. The horse had withdrawn his head slightly, but his gaze remained on Silas, still watchful, still present. All right, Silas whispered, more to himself than the horse. He turned towards the door, the heavy slide of it echoing as he pulled it open. The wind hit him, sharp and bracing. He stepped out into the gray afternoon, the frozen ground crunching underfoot once more. He walked a few paces towards his truck, head down against the wind, the image of Spirit's profound stillness, that single step, that whisper-soft touch, burned into his mind. He reached for the truck door handle, cold metal biting through his glove. A sound stopped him. Not the wind, not his boots. He turned. Spirit stood at the open top half of the stable door, his dark head silhouetted against the dim interior. He wasn't calling out, he wasn't whinnying, he was just watching Silas leave. His ears were pricked forward, focused intently. His body was tense, no longer the frozen statue but alert. Waiting. Silas stood by his truck, keys in hand, the winter world pressing in. The horse didn't move, didn't look away. Silas looked back at the silent figure in the doorway, a question forming in the cold air between them, heavy and unspoken. Why are you watching me? What do you want? But deeper, Beneath the frost and the grief, another question stirred, fragile and terrifying. What happens now? The fragile thread spun in the stable's cold air didn't snap. It held. Silas found himself returning, not out of obligation, but drawn by the echo of that velvet muzzle against his knuckles, and the weight of Spirit's watching eyes as he'd driven away. The routine began, clumsy at first. Mornings brought the crunch of frost, the scrape of the feed bucket, the rasp of the stiff brush over Spirit's dull coat. Silas moved through the tasks like a man under water, slow and heavy. His grief was a constant companion, a stone in his chest. Yet in the stable's quiet, punctuated only by Spirit's soft snorts and the rhythmic scrape of the curry comb, something else existed. A shared silence. A fragile truce. Spirit was no longer a statue. He moved now, ate with a quiet focus, watched Silas with those dark liquid eyes that seemed to absorb the world without judgment. But beneath the surface calm, Silas began to notice things. Subtle shivers that weren't from the cold, a tension in the powerful neck when the wind howled particularly fiercely from the direction of the frozen pond at the far edge of Eli's property. And the ears, always the ears. They'd flicker, tense, pin back almost imperceptibly whenever Silas, lost in thought, muttered Eli's name aloud while mucking the stall. Need to fix that hinge, Eli. Silas had grumbled one bitter morning, wrestling with the stiff stall door. The name hung in the air, sharp and sudden. Spirit, who had been peacefully lipping hay from his net, froze. His head snapped up. Ears swiveled rigidly backwards. His breath hitched, a sharp intake that sounded almost like a gasp. For a terrifying second his eyes widened, showing the whites, fixed on the far wall as if seeing something Silas couldn't. Then as quickly as it came, it passed. He lowered his head, resumed eating, but the rhythm was off. Uneasy. Silas stood frozen, brush dangling from his hand, the familiar ache in his chest tightening into a knot of confusion. Did he? The thought was absurd. Horses didn't understand names like that, did they? Days bled into weeks. The strange reactions deepened. Spirit became agitated, restless in his stall, whenever Silas approached wearing Eli's old, battered barn jacket he'd found shoved in a tack trunk. The horse would sidestep, snort, his nostrils flaring wide as he inhaled the lingering scent of tobacco and engine grease that was purely Eli. He'd allow Silas near only after Silas removed it, his body language softening, the wary tension easing from his powerful shoulders. It was more than aversion. It was a visceral response, a tremor running through the 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone whenever the ghost of Eli pressed too close. Silas tried to push it down, logic battling the growing, unsettling feeling. He told himself it was coincidence, residual stress from the accident, the horse picking up on his own grief. But the truth was a splinter working its way deeper. He felt Spirit watching him, not just seeing him, but seeing the hollow space Eli had left. The horse became a silent mirror, reflecting back the pain Silas tried so hard to bury under chores and routine. It was exhausting. It was relentless. He found himself talking less, moving quieter, trying not to trigger the horse's strange distress, trying to smother his own. The breaking point came on a day brittle with false spring sunshine. The thaw had begun, leaving the world slick and treacherous. Silas was clearing debris near the old pond, Eli's favorite spot for summer fishing, now a fractured plate of gray ice melting at the edges. He'd been avoiding it. Today, he forced himself. Raking soggy leaves, his boot slipped on the muddy bank. He caught himself, but his hand plunged into the icy water near the shore. The shock was physical, a jolt that traveled straight to his core. He gasped, yanking his hand back, shaking off the freezing slush. And then he saw it. Caught in the reeds his rake had disturbed, half submerged in the murky water. A small, rectangular piece of faded leather. Eli's tobacco pouch. The one he always carried, worn smooth from years in his pocket. Silas knew it instantly. He must have dropped it that day. The world tilted. The cold in his hand became insignificant. He lunged, grabbing the sodden pouch. It felt heavy, wrong. He fumbled, with the stiff flap, fingers numb. Inside, protected by the leather, wasn't tobacco. It was a small laminated photograph. Water had seeped in at the edges, blurring the colors, but the image was clear. Eli, impossibly young, grinning wide, one arm slung around Spirit's neck when the horse was just a gangly colt. Spirit's head was turned towards Eli, ears pricked, an expression of pure, trusting adoration in his young eyes. On the back, in Eli's messy scrawl, "My boys, best decision ever." The dam shattered. Not a slow leak, but a catastrophic rupture. The stone in Silas's chest exploded. Grief, sharp and savage, tore through him with the force of a physical blow. He sank to his knees in the icy mud, the photograph clutched in his frozen hand. A raw, guttural sob ripped from his throat, echoing across the silent pond. Then another. He couldn't stop. Months of stoicism, of choked-back tears, of pretending he could just manage the loss, dissolved into uncontrollable trembling and ragged, gasping cries that felt like they were tearing him apart from the inside. He was alone. Utterly, devastatingly alone in the muddy thaw, holding the ghost of his brother's happiness, the proof of a bond he'd never truly understood until it was gone. He didn't hear the approach, didn't sense the movement through his own storm. But suddenly warmth pressed against his hunched back, solid, immense warmth. He flinched, startled, turning his tear-blurred vision. Spirit stood beside him, not in front, not demanding attention. Beside him, parallel. His massive shoulder a solid wall against Silas's trembling frame. The horse's head was lowered, his breath warm and steady, fogging the cold air near Silas's ear. He didn't nudge, didn't wicker. He simply stood, still, anchored. His dark eye, deep and calm, gazed not at Silas, but out across the melting pond, as if standing guard. Silas's sobs hitched. The sheer solid presence of the animal, the unexpected warmth radiating through his coat, the rhythmic sound of Spirit's deep, calm breathing beside his own ragged gasps. It was an anchor in the storm. He leaned back, just slightly, letting his shoulder rest against the horse's solid flank. Spirit didn't move, didn't shift his weight. He simply stood absorbing Silas's tremors, his own breath a slow, steady counterpoint to the human anguish. He stayed. Through the shuddering cries, through the gasps for air, through the slow, exhausted ebbing of the tears, he stood, a silent sentinel against the cold and the crushing loneliness, until the last shudder passed and Silas was left hollowed out, spent, but no longer adrift. The horse's unwavering presence wasn't fixing anything. It was simply being there. Holding space for the unbearable. And in that profound, wordless act, something shifted. A weight Silas hadn't known he was carrying alone, was shared. Weeks later, the air smelled of damp earth and new grass, the sharp bite of winter finally a memory. The stable door stood open to the morning sun. Silas whistled softly, a tuneless thing, as he filled Spirit's water trough. The bay coat gleamed now, brushed to a deep, rich sheen. Spirit stood relaxed in his stall, one hind leg cocked, ears swiveling lazily towards the sparrows arguing outside. He watched Silas with calm eyes, no trace of the earlier tension, the haunted stillness. When Silas approached with the halter, Spirit lowered his head willingly, bumping Silas's shoulder gently with his muzzle. A greeting now, familiar and easy. "All right, big guy," Silas murmured, his voice rough but warm. "Let's stretch those legs." They walked not towards the pond, but across the greening pasture, the sunlight warm on their backs. The silence between them was no longer empty, but comfortable. Companionable. It held the shared weight of the winter, the echo of the breaking point by the water's edge, and the quiet understanding that had settled in its wake. Silas still missed Eli with a fierceness that stole his breath sometimes, but the stone in his chest had cracked open. Light, fragile but undeniable, filtered through. He breathed easier, slept deeper. The world held color again. One bright afternoon, Spirit, grazing contentedly near the fence line where wild daisies were just beginning to push through, lifted his head sharply. He snorted, ears pricked forward with sudden intense focus. Not towards the road or the house, but towards a tangle of old hawthorn bushes near the property's far corner, a spot Silas rarely visited. Spirit took a few steps, then stopped, looking back at Silas. He pawed the soft earth once, a clear, deliberate gesture. Curious, Silas followed. Spirit led him not with urgency, but with a quiet purpose, stopping every few paces to ensure Silas was coming. He pushed through the thorny branches, surprisingly careful, and stopped. Silas pushed through after him, brushing away cobwebs. There, nestled in the roots of the hawthorn, sheltered from the worst of the winter, was a cluster of the season's first wild violets. Tiny, fragile blooms of deep purple, their faces turned towards the sun. Eli's favorite. He used to pick them for their mother every spring, a small, stubborn defiance against the lingering cold. Silas knelt, not crying, just breathing. The scent of damp earth and the faint, sweet perfume of the violets filled his lungs. Spirit stood beside him, head lowered, his warm breath stirring the delicate petals. Silas reached out, his fingers brushing the velvety softness of a bloom. It wasn't Eli. It would never be Eli. But it was life. Insistent, beautiful life, pushing through the darkness. He looked up at Spirit. The horse met his gaze, his dark eyes reflecting the sunlight, holding a quiet knowing that seemed to stretch back through the frozen pond. The shared grief, the first tentative touch in the cold stable. Silas understood, then with a clarity that settled deep into his bones. Spirit hadn't just been Eli's horse. He hadn't just been carrying the ghost of his brother. He'd been carrying Silas too, through the ice, through the shattering, through the long thaw. Not as a replacement, but as a bridge built of silent presence, instinctive comfort, and the unspoken language of shared loss. The horse hadn't healed him. That wasn't its job. But Spirit had stood beside him in the deepest cold, reminding him, breath by steady breath, that he wasn't alone, that even in the frozen heart of grief, connection could take root. And sometimes the most profound healing begins not with words, but with a warm shoulder pressed against yours in the icy mud, and the quiet persistence of wild violets in the spring. He rested his hand on Spirit's strong neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath his palm. The horse leaned into the touch, a soft sigh escaping him. The sun was warm, the violets were purple, the world was still here. Silas took a deep breath. It didn't catch in his throat. He was ready. Not to forget. Never to forget. But to live. Again carrying the love, carrying the loss, carrying the quiet strength of the unexpected creature who had, without fanfare or demand, carried him. Sometimes the heart that saves you is the one you didn't know was waiting to be found. If this story found its way into your heart, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below. Tell us what moved you, and tap the bell icon. Because here every day brings a new story waiting to be shared, a new connection waiting to be made, a new heart waiting to be found. Be here for the next one. You just might need it.